So like Maldonado-Torres, Levinas is of the view that there's a fundamental aspect of Dasein's constitution which Heidegger has missed, and this is the face-to-face encounter with the other, a primordial event which, quote, brings the first signification, establishes signification itself in being. So whereas in Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein, others have featured principally as the they, purveyors of idle talk liable to tempt a Dasein into inauthenticity. In Levinas's estimation, the primordial encounter with the face of another is that which grounds or metaphysically enables all purposive interactions with equipment, all authentic or inauthentic stances towards one's impending death, even all cognitive or ratiocinative states of mind. Though he strongly disagrees with Heidegger about the nature and significance of the Dasein's relations with the other, Levinas does not reject the ontological difference or question the metaphysical priority of the ontological over the ontical. In this sense, even though he asserts that there is something yet more foundational than the ontological domain, which is Heidegger's focus, Levinas is still advancing what's, in that sense, a thesis within fundamental ontology. So his thesis is that the being, the how it be's of any of us, and the world as we encounter it, is indispensably constituted by our face-to-face encounters with others. Heidegger had argued that a condition of the possibility of any Dasein's theoretical or ratiocinative states is a prior, more fundamental, purposive engagement with the world of equipment. Levinas agrees with Heidegger about this, and agrees in his criticisms of Husserl, but he takes the search for metaphysically necessary conditions one step further, arguing that a condition of the possibility of any Dasein's care-infused purposive engagement with equipment is the primordial event of its face-to-face encounter with the face of the other. Like Heidegger's, Levinas's conclusions are universal in scope. They purport to apply to all Daseins. And the universal applicability of his conclusions, just like those of Heidegger, is not meant to be either sheer coincidence or a matter of contingent biological, psychological, or anthropological regularities. Those ontic matters of fact, which you read a posteriori from the record of empirical observation. Like Heidegger's conclusions about Dasein's being, Levinas's conclusions are meant to apply to the constitutive makeup of any given Dasein, no matter how that particular Dasein might differ from other Daseins in its facticity. And to persuade his reader of this kind of conclusion, Levinas, like Heidegger, makes use of transcendental argumentation, meaning argumentation to the effect that the constitutive structure of X is inconceivable without Y, and so since there is X, there must be Y. It's a transcendental argument. Like Heidegger, Levinas believes that his universal scope conclusions about the fundamental constitution of any given Dasein can be known a priori to be true. He appeals to experience, but he doesn't put those descriptions of experiences forward as a basis for a posteriori induction. Rather, they're supposed to make vivid to the reader the constitutive inconceivability of some X, some experience type familiar to all of us, in the absence of some Y, which for Levinas is a primordial face-to-face encounter with another. So it's that backdrop of agreement which makes Levinas's and Heidegger's what I would say is a disagreement among phenomenologists within the school of fundamental ontology about the being, and in Levinas's case, the yet more fundamental constitution, prior to being, of Daseins. By keeping that backdrop of agreement in view, one begins to see clearly, I'm going to put to you, how remarkable it is that Maldonado-Torres presents the coloniality of being thesis as a thesis within fundamental ontology. In reality, the coloniality of being thesis is a thesis not within, but I'm going to argue against fundamental ontology. In the first place, Maldonado-Torres' thesis differs from those of Heidegger and Levinas in its scope. Though he means what he says to apply to all Daseins, he does not claim to have identified structural features of the way of being of a Dasein which are features of the being of Daseins across the board. On the contrary, the coloniality of being thesis is precisely the thesis that there's a fundamental difference at the ontological level between two classes of Dasein. On the one hand, says this thesis, there are those Daseins which encounter the face of another, as Levinas describes, which engage in care-infused activity using equipment, as Heidegger describes, and which are perpetually at risk of falling or fleeing away from a potential authentic being towards death into average everydayness. On the other hand, says this thesis, there are colonized Daseins, the damnés. And the proper starting point for grasping the being of a damné, says Maldonado-Torres, is not the anarchic moment of the constitution of subjectivity in its encounter with the other, as in Levinas' theory, but, quote, the trauma of the encounter with the imperial and racist other. And while the class of Dasein which Heidegger and Levinas focus on is lost in the day and achieves authenticity when it anticipates its own death, the damné confronts the reality of its own finitude as a day-to-day adventure, Maldonado-Torres claims. So the coloniality of being thesis purports to detail not fundamental features which every Dasein's being exhibits, but fundamental differences between two classes of Dasein at the level of their very way of being. That's the ontological colonial difference. Now, being non-universal in scope does not in itself disqualify a thesis from being a thesis in fundamental ontology. After all, Heidegger's own account of being towards death entails that some Daseins will exhibit wholly or largely inauthentic being towards death, while other Daseins will exhibit wholly or largely authentic being towards death. But in the second place, the justification Maldonado-Torres offers for his coloniality of being thesis is not a priori and does not take the form of inference to the conditions of possibility of a type of experience recognizable to all. In Heidegger and Levinas' writings, there's an intimate connection between the scope and the status of their conclusions, on the one hand, and their manner of argumentation for them on the other. In Heidegger and Levinas, it's because some Y, for example, the primordial encounter with the other, or purpose of engagement with equipment, or the potential to be authentic, is a constitutive condition of the possibility of some X, some experience recognizable to all, that they believe they can safely infer that Y is a feature of the fundamental constitution of all Daseins, rather than a contingent element of the facticity of some Daseins, but not others. Maldonado-Torres, by contrast, in his characterization of what is called the being colonized of the damné, makes clear that he is bringing to our attention features with contingent social causes to be discovered through a posteriori observation of the lived experience of some colonized and racialized subjects, but not others, as he puts it, European man of us. A damné, Maldonado-Torres tells us, has a way of being with a fundamental structure different from that of the, quote, ordinary Dasein described by Heidegger and Levinas. He writes, the damné or condemned is not a being there, but a non-being, in the sense that it encounters a misanthropic skepticism and racism on the part of, quote, the imperial and racist other, rising to the high watermark of an attribution of absence of being to the damné. So agreeing with Fanon here, Maldonado-Torres writes, in a colonial anti-black world, the black person does not have ontological resistance or ontological weight in the eyes of the white person. But Maldonado-Torres is quick to add that things might not have been this way. Quote, the coloniality of being is not an inevitable moment or natural outcome. The coloniality of being appears in historical projects and ideas of civilization which advance colonial projects of various kinds, inspired or legitimized by the idea of race. The coloniality of being is therefore coextensive with the production of the color line in its different expressions and dimensions. The idea of race, imposing a racial classification upon people, ordering a society according to a race hierarchy, together with the attitudes of Manichaean misanthropic skepticism, to quote, which arise from and reinforce it, all of these are, as I described at the beginning, elements of what Aníbal Quijano called coloniality, or the coloniality of power. And so, as Maldonado-Torres has acknowledged, quote, what would best explain the coloniality of being would be the colonial difference and the logic of coloniality. He's saying that Quijano's concept, coloniality, explains the coloniality of being. We are then, I put it to you, forced to infer that the being colonized Maldonado-Torres attributes to those Daseins which he calls damné stands for contingent elements of these Daseins' facticity, knowable a posteriori on the basis of observation, rather than for essential features of the structure of their way of being, knowable a priori, which stay constant across changing practical circumstances. In the third place then, Maldonado-Torres' thesis is a thesis on the ontic plane. It is a thesis about ways people have, as a matter of contingent fact, been treated, ways they've been perceived, and the impact on their psychological orientation and subjectivity of being thus treated, and being aware of how others perceive them.